The wind howled as I stood at the edge of Dunsmuir, the small coastal town looking more like a graveyard than a place where people lived. The waves crashed violently against the rocks below, spraying salt into the air, mixing with the scent of blood that clung to everything like a ghost. Bodies had started showing up a week ago, and now they were piling up, each one found with eyes wide open, mouths twisted into silent screams, and blood crusted around their ears. I'd been hunting monsters long enough to recognize the signs, but this one felt different. This wasn't some cryptid lurking in the shadows, or a feral spirit trapped between worlds. No, this was something ancient, something that relished in the pain it caused. And I knew exactly what it was. A banshee. I leaned against a battered pickup truck, staring at the town's lone lighthouse in the distance. Its light flickered weakly, struggling against the fog that had settled in. I'd seen enough to know I was in over my head, so I did the one thing I'd been avoiding for years. I pulled out my phone and called R. He picked up on the second ring, his voice gruff and impatient. "You better be dying if you're calling me at this hour, kid." "I'm in Dunsmuir. Got a banshee problem," I said, keeping my voice steady. I could hear him sucking in a breath on the other end. "Shit," he muttered, and I could almost see him rubbing the back of his neck, eyes narrowing like they always did when he was thinking. "You need me there?" "Yeah, this one's different. It's strong, and it's not leaving until it's had its fill." There was a pause, and I could hear the faint sound of something being set on fire. A cigarette, knowing R. "I'll be there in 4 hours, he finally said. "Try not to get yourself killed before I show up." "Wouldn't dream of it," I replied, hanging up. 4 hours later, R's beat-up Chevy roared into town, coughing up a cloud of black smoke as it parked beside my truck. He stepped out, and I couldn't help but grin. He looked exactly the same. Worn leather jacket, scarred face, and that ridiculous silver chain he never took off. His hair was pulled back into a ponytail, long and gray in places, but it suited him. Made him look like the kind of man who'd walked through hell and come out the other side with a souvenir. And there it was, the tattoo. R's left arm was covered in ink, depicting an apocalyptic scene that crawled up his skin like a story etched in flesh. Skeletal figures rose from the ground, twisted and contorted, while flames licked up toward a massive radiation symbol at the center of his bicep, black and bold against his skin. It stood out like a warning, a promise of the violence he was capable of. It was impossible to ignore, even after all these years. "Damn, you look worse than the last time I saw you," I said, crossing my arms. "Good to see you too, asshole," R replied, pulling a duffel bag from his truck. He tossed it to me, and I almost fell over from the weight. "Thought you might need some proper firepower." I unzipped the bag, whistling low as I took in the contents. Flamethrowers, Molotovs, magnesium flares. If it could burn, it was in there. "Planning to burn down the whole town?" "If that's what it takes," he said, eyes narrowing. "This isn't just any banshee, Lucas. It's older, more violent. And if we don't kill it, it's going to kill everyone here." He tapped his prosthetic leg on the ground, metal clinking against stone. "You ready for this?" "Ready as I'll ever be," I replied. We made our way to the latest crime scene. A young woman found dead at the foot of a cliff, her hands twisted into claws, frozen in a final attempt to protect herself from whatever had come for her. Blood had pooled around her head, seeping into the cracks of the rocks, and her eyes. I had to look away. They were staring right through me, wide and glassy, as if the last thing she'd seen was something that tore her soul apart. R knelt down beside her, his tattoo shifting as he moved, the flames on his arm seeming to dance in the dim light. "It's feeding off fear," he muttered. "That's why it's getting stronger. The more people it kills, the more powerful it becomes." "And the more dangerous," I added, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. R nodded, his jaw clenched. "It'll be back soon. These things never stray far from their last kill. They're territorial." He glanced up at the lighthouse, its light flickering in the darkness. "That's where it's nesting." As if on cue, the air grew cold, and a shiver ran down my spine. A low, mournful wail filled the air, distant at first, but growing louder, closer. R stood up, his expression darkening. "Get ready," he said, pulling out a homemade flamethrower from his bag and handing me a Molotov. "We're burning this bitch tonight." The wail grew deafening, and suddenly she was there. The Banshee floated just beyond the light, her form translucent, her mouth stretched into a grotesque scream. Her eyes, black and endless, fixed on us, and I felt my heart skip a beat. R didn't hesitate. He squeezed the trigger on the flamethrower, a jet of fire erupting from the nozzle and bathing the Banshee in light. She screamed, her body writhing as the flames licked at her ethereal form. I watched, stunned, as parts of her began to dissolve, but she wasn't done. With a flick of her hand, she sent R flying into a nearby boulder, his flamethrower skidding across the ground. R! I shouted, but he waved me off, coughing. Throw the damn Molotov, Lucas, he snarled. I didn't hesitate. I lit the rag, drew back, and hurled it straight at her. The bottle shattered on impact, and the flames erupted, engulfing her in a brilliant blaze. Her screams pierced the night, a sound that made my ears bleed, but I held my ground, watching as she writhed and twisted in the inferno. But then, with a final, ear-splitting wail, she vanished, leaving nothing but smoke and ash in her wake. I rushed over to R, helping him to his feet. He grunted, brushing off the dirt. She's not dead, just pissed off. I figured, I muttered, wiping the blood from my ears. So what now? R grinned, his teeth flashing in the dim light, his tattoo seeming to burn as bright as the fire in his eyes. Now, we hunt. The morning sun barely pierced through the fog, leaving Dunsmuir in a gray, lifeless haze. It wasn't the weather, it was the shadow of death hanging over this town. R and I sat in the rundown motel room, the air thick with cigarette smoke, maps and weapons sprawled across the small table between us. The smell of burnt flesh and blood still clung to us, even after washing up. This thing's smart, R muttered, flicking his cigarette against the edge of an ashtray. That little display last night? That was just the opening act. I nodded, tracing my fingers over the map of Dunsmuir, where we'd marked the Banshee's sightings. It's circling the lighthouse, moving further out every night. We have to lure it back to its nesting ground if we want any chance of killing it. R leaned back, his prosthetic leg resting on a stool. The flames on his tattoo flickered as he moved, like they were alive, crawling up toward that radiation symbol etched in the center of his bicep. He tapped the map with the end of his cigarette. It's bound to the place it was born, the site of its death. We drag it back there. We burn it to ashes. How do we get it to come out again? I asked, glancing over at him. It's not exactly handing out invitations. R grinned, reaching into his duffel bag and pulling out something that made my stomach turn. A human skull. Its eye sockets empty and blackened. You'd be surprised what a bit of salt, blood, and bone can do to piss off a spirit, I grimaced. You carry that around with you? You never know when you'll need to draw out the dead, he replied, shrugging. It's called preparation. I couldn't argue with that. We made our way back to the lighthouse as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air grew colder with each passing minute, and I felt that familiar chill crawl down my spine. The ground was still stained from last night's battle, dark patches where the flames had scorched the earth. Set it up here, R instructed, handing me a canister of gasoline. We're going to make sure she can't escape this time. I doused the ground around the lighthouse, creating a ring of accelerant that would turn the entire area into a wall of fire once we lit it. R took his time setting up his makeshift altar, placing the skull in the center, surrounding it with salt and bits of bone he'd pulled from God knows where. He sliced open his palm with a knife, letting his blood drip onto the skull, the liquid turning black as it hit the surface. You always did have a flair for the dramatic, I muttered. Comes with the job, R replied, wincing as he wrapped a dirty rag around his hand. You ready? Let's do this, I said, pulling out my rifle and loading a fresh clip. We stood back, and R lit a flare, tossing it into the gasoline-soaked circle. The flames roared to life, encircling the lighthouse in an inferno of heat and light. And that's when we heard it. The Banshee's wail pierced the night, louder than before, rattling the windows of the nearby buildings. It was like nails scraping against my skull, each note digging deeper, threatening to split me apart. I could feel blood trickling from my ears, but I forced myself to keep moving, eyes scanning the darkness. There! R shouted, pointing toward the cliffs. The Banshee hovered just beyond the light, her form flickering like a shadow caught between worlds. Her eyes locked onto us, glowing with hatred, and she began to drift forward, her mouth unhinging to let out another ear-splitting scream. Wait for it, R muttered, his finger hovering over the trigger of his flamethrower. Wait! The Banshee shot forward, faster than I thought possible. I barely had time to raise my rifle before she was right in front of us, her skeletal fingers outstretched, reaching for my throat. R pulled the trigger, and a torrent of fire erupted from the nozzle, engulfing her in flames. She writhed and twisted, her shrieks blending with the crackling of the fire. But even as her body burned, she didn't stop. Her hand shot out, grabbing R by the throat and lifting him off the ground. The flames from his weapon sputtered, and he dropped it, clawing at her fingers as they tightened around his neck. R! I yelled, raising my rifle and firing, the bullets punching through her ethereal form, sending sprays of black, inky blood splattering across the ground. But she didn't let go. R's eyes bulged, his face turning red as he struggled to breathe. Desperation took over. I dropped the rifle, lunged forward, and grabbed one of the Molotovs from R's bag. I lit it with a shaky hand and, without thinking, smashed it against the Banshee's face. The flames exploded, and she screamed, her grip loosening just enough for R to drop to the ground, gasping and coughing. I pulled him back, shielding him from the heat as the Banshee writhed in the flames, her form flickering in and out of existence. "Damn it," R wheezed, clutching his throat. "That hurt like hell." "Yeah, well, she's not done yet," I muttered, pointing at the Banshee. Despite the flames licking at her body, she began to pull herself back together, her shrieks growing louder, more desperate. "We need to trap her," R said, his voice hoarse. "We have to push her into the lighthouse." I nodded, grabbing another Molotov and lighting it. I hurled it toward the Banshee, forcing her back, step by step, toward the lighthouse entrance. R picked up his flamethrower, limping as he moved, and joined me, spraying fire in her direction. The Banshee shrieked, retreating further and further until she crossed the threshold of the lighthouse. "Now!" R shouted. I grabbed the last Molotov, lit it, and threw it through the doorway. The flames roared to life, consuming the inside of the lighthouse, and for a moment, it was as if the whole structure was ablaze. The Banshee let out one final ear-splitting scream, and then silence. Her form flickered once, twice, and then dissolved into ash, carried away by the wind. R collapsed to the ground, panting, his prosthetic leg twisted at an odd angle. You better hope I don't need this thing fixed," he muttered, grinning up at me. I couldn't help but laugh, even as blood dripped down my face. "You're the one who decided to wrestle with her." "Yeah? Well, I was getting bored," he said, lighting another cigarette with shaking hands. "We're not done yet, kid. She'll come back if we don't finish the job." "I know," I said, looking toward the burning lighthouse, watching as the flames climbed higher. "But we will. Together." The lighthouse burned like a beacon in the night, flames licking the sky, sending thick plumes of smoke swirling into the darkness. I could feel the heat on my face, could taste the ash on my tongue. But the fire wasn't enough. It wouldn't be enough to kill this thing. Not permanently. R sat against a boulder, his prosthetic leg twisted and useless, pain etched across his face. "We're not done," he said, his voice strained, eyes flickering toward the burning lighthouse. "You know she's still in there, right?" "Yeah," I muttered, my grip tightening on the last Molotov in my hand. "She's not going down without a fight." I could still hear it. The faint, bone-chilling wail echoing from inside the lighthouse. The Banshee's scream was weaker now, more desperate, but it was still there. "She's anchored here," R continued, gritting his teeth as he tried to adjust his leg. "The place of her death. That's why we need to burn her, body and all." "And how exactly do we do that?" I asked, glancing at him. "She's not exactly volunteering to step into the flames." R's lips curled into a pained grin, and he gestured to the gasoline canisters we'd brought. "We're going to make her." We dragged what was left of our supplies into the lighthouse's crumbling doorway. The heat was intense, driving sweat from every pore, the crackling flames filling the air with the scent of burning wood and charred stone. I could see her now, just beyond the veil of fire, her form flickering, twisted, and broken. She was screaming, clawing at her face, trying to pull herself together, trying to survive. R pulled out a flare from his jacket, the light reflecting off the ink of his apocalyptic tattoo. "You take the left, I'll take the right," he said, standing with a groan. "We're gonna give her nowhere to run." We moved in tandem, dousing the ground, the walls, every inch of the lighthouse interior with gasoline. The flames crackled higher, and the Banshee's wail grew louder, more frantic. She saw us then, her black eyes locking onto mine, and for a moment, I felt it. The overwhelming weight of her sorrow, the endless grief that had turned her into this monster. It hit me like a wave, nearly knocking me off my feet, and I stumbled back, gasping. "Don't let her in!" R yelled, his voice cutting through the fog in my mind. "She'll use your fear against you." I forced myself to breathe, to push back against the Banshee's despair. I couldn't afford to hesitate now. I grabbed the last canister of gasoline and hurled it into the flames, the liquid exploding in a brilliant flash of light, the fire spreading faster, hotter. The Banshee screamed, her form thrashing against the heat, but she didn't disappear. She didn't vanish like before. This time she stepped forward, her skeletal fingers reaching through the flames, her eyes locked onto mine. I could see her face now, twisted in rage, but behind that fury, I saw something else. Fear. R limped forward, holding the flare in his hand, eyes fixed on the Banshee. "This is it, Lucas," he said, his voice hoarse. "This is where we end her." I nodded, raising the Molotov. Together. We moved as one. I hurled the bottle, glass shattering against her chest, flames erupting across her body. R stepped forward, the flare blazing in his hand, and with a final shout, he drove it into the center of her chest. The Banshee's scream split the night, so loud, so piercing, that I felt something rupture in my ears, blood trickling down my neck. But I didn't look away. I couldn't. I watched as her body burned, as the flames consumed her, turning flesh and bone to ash. Her form flickered, fading in and out, until all that was left was a charred, blackened husk. And then, she was gone. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the crackling of the flames and the faint whisper of the wind. I stood there staring at the spot where she'd been, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But there was nothing. No scream, no shadow, just ash drifting on the wind. "It's over," R muttered, sinking to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We did it." I moved to his side, helping him sit against the wall of the lighthouse, the firelight dancing across his tattoo. "You all right?" He laughed, the sound rough and painful. "No, but I'm alive, aren't I? That's gotta count for something." He looked up at me, his eyes glinting with something that almost resembled pride. "You did good, kid." "Wouldn't have made it without you," I admitted, leaning back against the wall, exhaustion washing over me like a wave. My body ached, every muscle screaming for rest, but I couldn't stop the smile that tugged at my lips. "What's next?" R grinned, his face illuminated by the dying flames. "There's always another monster, another hunt. You know that." I nodded, looking out over the cliffs, the town of Dunsmuir slowly coming back to life beneath us. "Yeah, I know." We sat there for a while, watching the fire burn, until there was nothing left but embers and ash. And as I stood, helping R to his feet, I felt it, the pull, the itch for the next hunt, the next challenge. "Where do you think you'll go next?" I asked, slinging R's arm over my shoulder. "Doesn't matter," he said, wincing as we started down the hill. "Wherever it is, I'll be ready." I glanced back at the lighthouse one last time, the final remnants of the flames flickering out, leaving only darkness. And in that darkness, I could already see the shadows shifting, moving, waiting for us. The job was never done. But for now, we'd won. And that was enough.